Today's video has to do with UI. And why might you use UI in a game? Maybe you want to display some metagame information. Things like health, the amount of gold that you have, how much time is remaining, how much damage does your enemy deal, what kind of weapon you're holding, who are you speaking to. All of those things might be outside of the context or near the context of whatever projection of your character or your avatar is, or it might be on the outside or the framing of your view of the game. Let's maybe think like classic Mario. There is a section that tells you what level you're on, how much time is remaining, um, things like that, how many points you have, coins. All of those things are metagame information that you want to be displaying at any given time. And so you as a developer or designer might think that this is important stuff that your user might know at any given time or at a specific time, and you might use UI to display that. UI has a visual element to it, and so it can contribute to the aesthetic of your game, and things that match the color or the style might enhance the experience. And then also systems that allow you to control certain things, like volume or a pause, reset the level, exit the game. Those things are have nothing to do with your character health, but allow you access as a player to control certain things. And so maybe you might use UI as a portal to do those things. So today's video is going to cover three main things: the importance of using the line using Unity.ui when we're using Unity's UI elements. This is separate from the Unity element. And then also system that holds that information, relevant information. Maybe it's the goal, the health, or the time. And then having a system that actually displays those. And in today's video, we're going to use two separate scripts because I think it's important to have each script do a specific job. They can be all attached to the same object if you want, but we want to be separating these two separate jobs because in the case you want to separate them and clean things up, you don't want to have one gigantic monolithic script that rules them all. It's much easier to be flexible and separate. So let's dive into Unity. Maybe your project looks something like this. I have a really basic, bare bones scene, which is representing a side-scrolly environment, and maybe we have our characters trying to collect certain things, and we want to show how many collectibles it has. I have a character right here, and the rest are just platformy objects, and I have a key object, which happens to be this little wormy little dude. This worm dude has some scripts attached to it. It has a box collider, and it has a tag called collectible. Obviously it has a sprite renderer, and we're hoping that my character can run into this thing, and when it does, I want to increase the number of keys that I have collected, and I want to eventually show it on my screen. So I have my game view here, my scene view here, and I have my Scully character. So let's just demo what is working and what isn't at the moment. I have my character moving around, and I'm able to jump, but when I bump into it, it's not really doing anything. So I need to write some code that recognizes when my character bumps into something that I might consider as a collectible, and then increase that value. So why don't we go to my character, and we're going to add a new script. One thing that's important is that we have two separate colliders here, and we may be using both of these to recognize when we bump into something in our script. So let's go and add a component, and we're going to call this character collections. As we're doing this, it's important to recognize what type of colliders we're going to be running into. Usually when we're bumping into something that's good, like a coin or a health or something like that, we typically use a collider that is set to is trigger, because it allows us the character to sort of move into that space and make it seem like they picked it up. If they were just bumping into it with our edges of our colliders, visually it's less satisfying, and if our colliders are not fully aligned to the outline of our character, it can be sort of visually disconnecting. So let's go back into the important thing that I'm saying is this thing should have a is trigger collider, although you can have it if you don't want to. I usually have these colliders set to is trigger. Going back to my character, I'm going to load up that character collection script, and what we're going to do is we're going to be using the built-in Unity method of on trigger enter 2D. We're using a 2D environment, and so we're going to use the 2D flavors for all of the methods. And so what we're going to do is we know that we have this object, and maybe we have many of them. I'll duplicate another one so we can collect more than one. So we have a key here and a key here, and we're going to set these key objects to have a tag of collectible with a capital C. And so what happens is this script is attached to our character, and whenever we bump into an object with a collider set to is trigger, this automatically gets called. And what we're going to do is use the collision, lower C collision variable that's referencing the 2D collider that we run into. We're going to say collision dot compare tag. We're going to say if compare tag, and if that tag belongs to the capital C collectible tag, then we wanted to say that, oh, we ran into a collectible. And if that's the case, then we can tell it to do a couple things. We said that we want to make it look like we're collecting it, and maybe we want to have that collectible disappear. So we'll say collision dot game object. That's going to be a reference to the game object that the collider belongs to. I'm going to say that we're going to destroy that particular object. Let's try that. So from here, we're just checking to see if we run into something that has a collider that's set to is trigger, and we're going to look at that collider's game object to see if it compares to the tag collectible. And if we spelled this to match the collectible that we have over here, then it should jump into these set of brackets. And if that's the case, we're going to tell the game object that the collider belongs to destroy itself. So let's go back into Unity. We have these two little wormy dudes, and we'll jump and eat them all up. So let's try that again. Great. So they got destroyed as these lines were executed. And the second thing that we want to do is, we said that this is the character collections, and maybe we want to be keeping track of how many keys we collect. We're calling those keys. So let's create a placeholder or variables that are going to register how many we've collected. And so we'll set these to be private int keys collected. And maybe at the start we always start out with 0. And when we bump into that object, now we can increase the collected value. So we'll go over here, we'll have that variable, and we're going to increase it by 1. This plus plus is just like typing it out like this. If this makes sense, you totally do it this way. The other way, plus plus is the same thing. We're just incrementing by 1. And since we set this serialized field private, we should be able to see that value in the inspector. So let's go back to Skelly. And we should be able to see that field down here. Keys collected, 0. Let's jump into the game. we collected it, and our key collected is that value. Moving the other one, now we have 2. Great. So that value is maybe important to us, and we want to be able to show it to our players on the screen at any given time. Let's talk about how we might display that value. So going back here, this is storing those values, right? And it's a good idea, and even though that this is a really short script, we might be really tempted to display these values, and that's probably not a good idea. What I suggest we do is we have this, we'll call this keys collected. It's all key collected, but let's just say keys collected. Just make them all plural. And how can we do this? Let's make this a public int, and we can make let's make a public variable, a public method, and we'll say get keys. And it's going to return an integer value. And this function is going to get called by our UI manager. And so what this does is it just returns, how did I get over there? Returns here, returns the keys collected variable, whatever that value is. Our other script is going to call this public method and be able to get that variable. Cool. So back onto our character, we're going to make a separate object, and this is going to be our UI manager object. We're going to have this object called UI manager, and this manager is only occupied about grabbing that keys collected value and then displaying it. So let's name this script also UI manager. The number one job of this particular script is to grab the value from the character and then display it. So let's go back into this code. And in order for this UI manager to get that information, it needs to have a reference to the value of the keys collected. Before we can do that, it probably has to get a reference to the character collection script, which is on the character. There's a few ways to go about this, and some ways better than others. The most simplest way, maybe we'll do it today. What we're going to do is we're going to do serialized field private, and we're going to make a reference variable to the character collection script, because that's where it holds that keys collected. Sorry, the get keys method. This is what we want to get, because that returns the value there. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a reference to the character collections class. And we're going to call this, we'll just call it character collections. Super. So the syntax here is we're making this a serialized private field, and it's a reference to the type of class character collections, and the instance or the variable name is character collections. Cool. And so since we have this set to a serialized private field, we have this field exposed to us in the inspector, and we could just drag in our character into that spot, because our character has an instance of this character collections on itself. And you'll notice that once we pull it in there, it says Skelly, that's the name of the object, and then the character collections is the class that we're looking for, that script that's on the Skelly. Now that we have a reference to that specific one, we should be able to call get. We should use character collections dot get keys method, And that's going to return, remember that this method returns the number of keys collected. And that's going to come back as an integer value, right? And so let's just, we can, what can we do? We can just use a console dot, no, sorry, not console. I've been using a whole bunch of different languages lately. Debug.log. And we're just going to see that value get updated in our console. So we're going to pull up our console and clear it out, enter play, and we should be able to see zeros and then 1 when we collect something. You can see that there. We have 1 key collected, and let's jump and grab the other 1 key. And 2. There's the other one here. Sorry, I have a mess of other stuff getting printed out. I can comment that out. Where is this bad boy here? Cool. Let's try this one more time. We should only see the 0, 1, and 2. And those values should change when we go and jump on the key. 1, 2. Cool. Now that we know that we are grabbing that value from our character, we can have a UI manager display that somewhere, right? Because we know that we can grab this value here. So we want to be able to display UI elements. What happens when Unity wants to use UI? We can go to hierarchy, go to create, drop down into UI, and let's select a couple of things. Let's use the Text Mesh Pro. We could use classic text and we could use Text Mesh Pro. Text Mesh Pro is just a little bit more fancy. If you haven't imported Text Mesh Pro, go ahead and import the essentials. We don't need the examples or the extras this time around. Text Mesh Pro has a few more options than regular text. And you can type in stuff in the text window, change the font, the style, size, color, and a few more options. Let's close this window. Now that we have this on here, you'll notice that we added the Text Mesh Pro, but along with that particular object came a canvas object and the event system. There's a few things that we want to talk about. So this is the thing that we asked for, but you'll notice that the text is associated now, a child with a canvas. If I double click on this canvas, we'll zoom out and you notice this big white box that is much bigger than our regular scene view. And this smaller box is the projection of our camera, our 2D camera. And once you start using UI, this is kind of confusing, but this box here represents where UI is going to sit for our game. And don't be distracted by how big it is, okay? And once we select this canvas, let's go over here and we can notice that there's a few options. This canvas object has a Rex transform. Then it also has the render mode. And in different situations, you're going to change this from screen space overlay to world space or screen space camera. World space is if we want to show something like there's a little monitor in a game, and that monitor might change some text on there. Maybe if you're playing a classic game like System Shock or something like that, and the readout changes based on game stuff. That's in-game information. That's in the world space. If we want to have something like Mario, where we're showing the level and the score and the time, then we usually want to be using the screen space overlay. And here we're going to use the Text Mesh Pro text object, and you notice that when we select it, we can find it in the hierarchy. Right now, it's not inside our canvas space, and if we drag it in here, keep your eye on the right side of this game, I'm going to pull it in here, we should see that text relative to the box that is our viewing space. So if I drag it over here, then maybe we want to be showing how many collectibles we have in our upper left corner. Great. This text size might be too big in this context, and maybe I'll just reduce the size of that. Maybe I'll do it even smaller. Oh, you'll notice that when I'm pulling this around, you see my canvas size changing and my text box moving in and out of my space. This is a really important thing. I know that maybe in your game you've selected a different view or resolution or aspect ratio. Now is the time when we start using UI that's super important to figure out the ideal dimensions that you have. You might make a game that's going to be flexible and have different dimensions, totally fine. But you should pick an ideal size at least by this time, because you're going to have a world of heartache when you go back and forth from something that's drastically different. UI can adapt to different sizes, but you should always pick one that's ideal and then move on from there. When we pick an aspect ratio, the elements are not necessarily anchored to the ratio. If we pick something like 1920 by 1080, then once we move something around and we resize the viewing area, those elements stay in relative position. All right, so now that I've set to my ideal screen size to be 1920 by 1080, I can start adjusting everything. So move it back to where it was before, and maybe we want to have something like this. You'll notice that when I made it to the size bigger, if we zoom in over here, my text box is here, but my text overflowed into this area. There's a setting that you can tell it to overflow. You can see that overflow here, overflow, and there's different ways that it could be masked if you did have it a different setting. If we go masking, then it may disappear. The wrap mode is whether it's going to have a carriage return if it goes beyond the bounds. And since I have it disabled, it just flows in here. But maybe I can just readjust the size of my text box to accommodate some more text. And this is something you have to think about. How much information are you going to be showing? This thing is collecting how many keys we have, right? And so I can test out something like this. I can type out keys, colon, and maybe this is the format that I have for how many keys. And at any given time, I'm not showing any more than a double-digit amount of keys. And so I know that in the future, no matter how many I've collected, my character will not collect more than 99. And I don't need to have my text box more larger than this. And it shouldn't be smaller. Otherwise, it's going to be underflowing or overflowing. So this is a great spot for keys, right? And we can save that. Let's jump back into our UI manager. And we know that now we have a spot to show the number of keys that we've collected. And in order to do that, our script needs to understand that number one, we're dealing with UI elements, and then number two, which UI element are we actually talking to, and then display that information. So first thing that we want to do is, if we're using UI, we need to be using the Unity engine.ui namespace. It's slightly gray because we don't have any UI elements in the script yet, and you'll notice that this is going to turn dark black after we start using that. So we have our character collections field. The other one that we want to have now is our TMP Pro text. TMP text. Do we need to have TMP? Yes. Or I think that we can be going like this. Using TM Pro here, access that namespace at this moment, and then just go like that. There we go. Great. So now we have a reference to our text. Oh, I guess we don't need to have our UI at the moment. Maybe we'll be cool with that since we're using Text Mesh Pro and not the regular text. Cool. At any given rate, we have the reference to the text object that we want to be sending this value to. So once we have that, then we can go and update, and after we've grabbed that value, be it 0, 1, 2, we're going to send it over to this text object here. And we know that our text object has many parameters that we can control. Font size, style, all those things. But the value that we want to send the number of keys to is the text property of the Text Mesh Pro object. Yeah. So we can't just simply type text. Unity is not going to like that. It's going to be like, oh, you're referring to an object, but you're not referring to a specific parameter. So we know that we're dealing with the text object, but we need to reference the text field. And the last thing that we need to do is we know that what type of data are we grabbing from this method? Is it a string or a character or a number? It's a number, right? If you go back here, you'll notice that our getKeys method returns an integer, which is not a string or a character. And so what we need to do is, after we've grabbed it, we need to turn that integer to a string. And delete the debug.log. So now we're saying that on the character collections has a getKeys method. It returns a number, and we want to recast that number into a string because the text object accepts strings. You notice that it says string right here, and it gets and sets string values. If we send an integer or a float, it won't know what to do. This is why we have to have this toString method on there. Let's go back into Unity and let's test this out. Oh, what is it don't like? Oh, yeah, what does it say? Object reference not set to an instance of an object. Cool. So what that's telling us is that if we double click on it or just look at it here, it says the UI manager line 21, the value, the reference is not set. So what that means is it doesn't know what text TM text pro object it's referring to. So if we go to here, UI manager, we'll notice that this field is empty. It says none. I forgot to drag in this object here, and now it knows exactly where to send that text. Let's go back into Unity. No errors this time. We can jump. Notice that number changes to 1. And that number changes to 2. Great. Cool. But we had our demo that said keys, colon, space, blah, blah, blah. How do we make that work? There's a lot of ways to concatenate strings, and the most basic one is whatever values we send over here like this would be a literal over to that text. What we can do is we know that that number is the last value that we want to send, and we want to imitate this sort of thing. What we can do is we can say keys around quote colon space end quote and a plus. What that does is take this value, oh, it doesn't like single quotes, keys colon space there because it has a space there, and then we're going to grab the value of the strings, grab the value and then turn it into a string. You can see that it says keys with a 0. Grab that. Boom. Great. Hope this helps. Talk to you guys later.